The metal tray hits the wooden table with a soft clink. September 1945. An emaciated Japanese soldier stares down at what lies before him. His body weighs maybe 90 pounds, maybe less. Thick slabs of white bread sit next to generous portions of ham. Fresh vegetables fill one corner of the tray. No wilting, no rot, no mold. Portions that seem impossible. His trembling fingers reach for the utensil. The shaking isn't fear, it's pure disbelief. This scene played out countless times. American prisoner camps across the Pacific witnessed identical moments. Thousands of Japanese soldiers encountered something beyond their imagination. Enemy hands offering abundance. Their own military had starved Allied prisoners systematically, brutalized them without mercy. Yet these same Japanese POWs would pack on 30 pounds, 40 pounds. Some gained 50 pounds or more, all while held captive by their sworn enemies. What created this stunning reversal? What truths does it reveal about honor, about warfare, about basic human decency? The Pacific War was reaching its bloody climax by summer 1945. Japan's once mighty empire was collapsing piece by piece. Relentless Allied bombing had reduced entire cities to smoking ruins. The homeland faced imminent invasion. Food shortages had become catastrophic. Civilians survived on tree bark. They ate roots pulled from the ground, any scrap of nutrition they could locate. For Japanese fighting men, surrender remained unthinkable. The military's battlefield code from 1941 was crystal clear. Death before dishonor. Capture meant ultimate shame. Japan had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention governing POW treatment, but they never ratified it. Their reasoning? Surrender contradicted fundamental Japanese military beliefs. This philosophy didn't just shape how they fought. It determined how they treated captured enemies. Japanese forces took roughly 350,000 prisoners during the war. The death rate among these captives reached 27%. Compare that to Allied prisoners held by Germans and Italians. Their death rate was 4%. American servicemen captured by Japanese faced systematic horror. Forced labor until collapse. Starvation rations that barely sustained life. Medical neglect that bordered on murder. But when fortune's wheel turned, something extraordinary happened. Japanese soldiers began surrendering as their empire crumbled. They braced for execution. They expected torture. Instead, they met an enemy that actually followed wartime rules. The first surrenders came in small clusters. Isolated soldiers cut off from their units. Survivors from defeated garrisons. Men too wounded or sick to keep fighting. Every arrival showed the same stunned expression. They weren't going to die. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Thompson processed prisoners at multiple Pacific camps. He remembered the bewilderment etched on their faces. They expected execution, he recalled later. Many believed Americans were savages. Stories claimed Americans would torture them before killing them. Reality shattered those expectations completely. They found themselves receiving food, clean clothing, medical treatment for their wounds. The contrast was shocking beyond words. These men had survived for months on rice portions that barely sustained life. Years, sometimes. Many showed advanced symptoms of beriberi. Vitamin deficiency had ravaged their bodies. Others displayed severe protein malnutrition. Muscle mass had disappeared. Hair had thinned dramatically. Their bodies were consuming themselves just to function. American military rations created immediate psychological impact. Single meals contained more calories than they might receive in entire weeks. Real meat appeared regularly, not occasional fish heads, not strips of dried horse flesh. Actual beef and pork and chicken. Vegetables arrived fresh or properly preserved, not rotting scraps they'd grown accustomed to eating. But quantity wasn't the only shock. The regularity amazed them. The cleanliness surprised them. The genuine concern their captors showed for prisoner health and well-being stunned them completely. The United States military had made deliberate decisions about prisoner treatment. They would follow international law, even when dealing with enemies who showed no such restraint. This decision came from the highest command levels. It reflected practical considerations and deeply held American values about human dignity. General Douglas MacArthur commanded Allied forces in the Pacific. His directives about POW treatment were crystal clear. These weren't suggestions or recommendations. They were direct orders backed by full American command authority. Violations would result in court-martial proceedings. The practical reasoning was sound and strategic. Proper prisoner treatment served multiple important purposes. It encouraged more surrenders. That saved American lives. It provided valuable intelligence-gathering opportunities. It demonstrated to the watching world that America fought according to civilized standards, even against enemies who didn't reciprocate. American camp commanders received detailed instructions covering every aspect of prisoner care: nutrition guidelines, medical care protocols, housing standards, work assignment procedures. These weren't minimum standards designed to keep prisoners barely breathing. They were comprehensive guidelines aimed at maintaining health and preserving human dignity. Dr. Margaret Hansen was a military nutritionist who developed feeding protocols for Japanese POWs. She remembered the careful planning their care required. "We considered more than just calories," she recalled. "The psychological impact of food mattered enormously. Many hadn't seen proper meals in years. We needed gradual intake increases to prevent refeeding syndrome." Rapid nutrition restoration can actually prove dangerous. Meal times became exercises in cultural shock for Japanese prisoners. Their own military had maintained strict food rationing. Severe scarcity was normal. Officers ate better than enlisted men always. Wasting even single grains of rice was considered criminal behavior. Meals were consumed in silence typically, quickly and anxiously, always wondering when the next meal might come. American mess halls operated on completely different principles. Prisoners were encouraged to eat until satisfied. Second helpings weren't just permitted. They were actively offered. The variety seemed impossible to believe. Different bread types with every meal. Multiple vegetables served together. Dairy products most Japanese soldiers had rarely tasted. Even during peacetime. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto was captured on Okinawa in June 1945. He later described his first American meal. "I thought some mistake had occurred. The portions were enormous. I asked the guard if this was special interrogation food. Food to make me talk. He laughed and said this was regular chow. I didn't believe him until I watched every prisoner getting identical treatment. Meal after meal after meal. The abundance created unexpected problems. Many prisoners hoarded food initially. They couldn't trust that next meals would actually arrive. Others ate so rapidly and desperately they made themselves physically sick. American medical staff implemented gradual feeding programs for severely malnourished prisoners. Portions increased slowly over weeks. This allowed digestive systems to readjust safely. Perhaps most shocking was witnessing waste. Japanese prisoners watched American soldiers leave food on plates sometimes. Bread crusts got discarded. Portions they didn't want got thrown away. This casual attitude toward food represented abundance so complete that waste was possible. It challenged everything they understood about wartime reality. The physical transformation of Japanese POWs in American custody was dramatic and measurable. Military medical records document weight gains that seemed almost impossible. Men arriving at 80 or 90 pounds reached 130 or 140 pounds within months. Muscle mass returned to normal levels. Hair regained thickness and color. Diseases caused by malnutrition began disappearing entirely. Dr. Robert Chen was a Chinese-American physician working with Japanese POWs. He maintained detailed recovery records. The human body's ability to recover from severe malnutrition is remarkable when proper nutrition is provided, he noted. But what we observed went beyond normal medical recovery. These men weren't just regaining health. They were reaching better physical condition than they'd maintained for years, possibly their entire adult lives. Medical staff faced unique challenges with arriving prisoners. Many had untreated wounds from combat. Tropical diseases were common. Complications from prolonged malnutrition created complex cases. American military hospitals were equipped and staffed to handle these situations. Even forward area facilities had capabilities that Japanese medical services couldn't match. Years of war had depleted their resources completely. Dental care proved particularly shocking to prisoners. Many had never experienced professional dental treatment of any kind. American military dental care was considered routine by American soldiers. To men whose teeth had been rotting for years without treatment, it seemed like luxury medicine beyond imagination. But medical care's psychological impact went beyond physical healing. These Japanese soldiers had been conditioned to expect torture and death from capture. Instead, they found American doctors and medics working to restore their health, with the same dedication shown to American patients. No difference in care quality or commitment. Weeks turned into months. The cumulative effect of proper food, medical care, and humane treatment began shattering long-held beliefs about their captors, about their own military's propaganda. These men had been taught Americans were barbaric, that they showed no mercy to Japanese prisoners, that death in battle was preferable to captivity horrors. Instead, they experienced treatment superior to what they'd received in their own military. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming and devastating. If Americans were truly savage enemies, they'd been taught to fear. Why such careful treatment? If their own cause was truly righteous, why had their commanders shown so little concern for basic human needs? Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka was captured in the Philippines. He wrote in his diary during captivity, "Every day I expect the kindness to end, for real treatment to begin. But it doesn't happen. Americans continue feeding us better than our own officers fed us. They continue treating our sick and wounded. I don't understand this war anymore." The weight gain became more than physical recovery. It became visible proof of uncomfortable truths. Their own military had been willing to let them starve, while their enemies were committed to keeping them healthy and well-fed. This realization raised questions that would follow these men long after war's end. If they had been so wrong about American intentions, what else had they been wrong about? As the war drew toward its close, as Japan's total defeat became undeniable, these well-fed, healthy prisoners faced the most difficult question of all. What would await them in a homeland that might never forgive them for surviving when so many others had died? Summer 1945 brought more than just hostilities ending. For thousands of Japanese prisoners scattered across American camps throughout the Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States mainland, their physical transformation was nearly complete. Men who had arrived as walking skeletons now carried healthy weight. Their uniforms required multiple alterations to accommodate expanding frames. But the real reckoning was just beginning to unfold. August 15th brought Emperor Hirohito's voice crackling over radio waves. His announcement of Japan's surrender used words that shocked an entire nation. The war situation has not necessarily developed to Japan's advantage. For Japanese POWs listening in American camps, this moment marked not liberation, but the beginning of their most difficult challenge yet. Returning to a homeland that might not forgive them for surviving. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August had fundamentally altered defeat's landscape. As news filtered into POW camps, Japanese prisoners grappled with reports that seemed impossible to believe. Single bombs destroying entire cities. Weapons leaving shadows burned into stone and concrete where human beings had once stood. For many prisoners, these reports validated their growing understanding. This war had been unlike anything in human history. The Americans who had fed them so well possessed weapons of unimaginable destruction. If the stories were true, and they increasingly appeared to be, Japan had been fighting an enemy whose industrial and technological capabilities dwarfed anything they had imagined. Corporal Kenji Nakamura had gained 43 pounds during his California captivity. He later wrote about hearing the surrender news. "We thought we understood American strength when we saw how well they fed us, how efficiently they ran their camps. But the atomic bombs showed us we had been fighting gods, not men. How could our leaders have believed we could win?" The psychological impact was devastating and complete. These men had been raised believing in Japanese racial superiority, in divine protection of the emperor, in the righteousness of their cause. The atomic bombs shattered those beliefs as completely as they had shattered Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Repatriation began almost immediately after surrender, but the process would stretch over several years. From 1945 to 1954, some 6,240,000 Japanese people would relocate to Japan. This accounted for 10% of the entire Japanese population. A massive human migration, including not just POWs, but millions of civilians who had been living throughout the former Japanese Empire. For POWs held by American forces, the journey home began with final irony. After months of weight gain and improving health, many now found themselves better nourished than they had ever been in their adult lives. American military doctors conducted final medical examinations. These documented the remarkable transformation that had occurred in their care. The contrast with prisoners held elsewhere was stark and obvious. While Western Allied POWs were generally held in good conditions, those taken by the Soviet Union were treated harshly in Siberian work camps. The USSR continued holding hundreds of thousands long after war ended. The Soviets wouldn't begin major repatriation until late 1946. They freed 625,000 the following year. Many wouldn't return until the mid-1950s. American-held prisoners, by contrast, began their homeward journey within months of surrender. They boarded ships, many the same vessels that had brought American troops across the Pacific. This would be their final taste of American abundance. Meals served during the voyage home continued the pattern of generous portions and careful nutritional attention that had characterized their entire captivity. But, as the Japanese coastline appeared on the horizon, many prisoners felt not joy, but dread instead. The Japan that greeted returning POWs in late 1945 and 1946 bore little resemblance to the country they had left behind. American bombing campaigns had reduced most major cities to ruins. Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of smaller cities were wastelands of ash and twisted metal. The survivors lived in shanties built from scraps. They struggled with severe food shortages. They faced a winter that threatened mass starvation. Into this devastated landscape came the returning prisoners. Healthy, well-fed, often carrying small gifts or personal items accumulated during their American captivity. The contrast was immediately obvious and deeply uncomfortable. Taro Suzuki was repatriated from a Hawaiian camp. He described his arrival in Yokohama port. "I had gained 57 pounds in American custody. I was probably the healthiest-looking person in the entire port. People stared at me like I was some kind of alien. My own family barely recognized me. Not because I looked different, but because I looked so well-fed when everyone else was starving." Indeed, the sight of formerly imprisoned soldiers returning in better condition than those who had remained at home created immediate social tension. How could men who had been captured by the enemy, the ultimate shame in Japanese military culture, appear more prosperous than those who had endured the bombing, the hunger, and the final desperate months of war? In pre-war Japanese military culture, capture was considered worse than death. The military code explicitly stated soldiers should choose death before dishonor. Surrender was the ultimate dishonor possible. Families often held memorial services for captured soldiers. They treated them as dead rather than face the shame of having a son or husband in enemy hands. But the reality of these returning POWs complicated those cultural assumptions completely. They had not only survived captivity, but had been treated with humanity their own military had never shown to its enemies. Many carried detailed knowledge of American industrial capacity, military organization, and social attitudes. This painted a picture of their former enemy radically different from wartime propaganda. The psychological burden was enormous and crushing. These men had to reconcile their survival and relatively good treatment with a lifetime of cultural conditioning telling them they should have chosen death. They had to explain to families and communities why they looked healthier than people who had never been captured. They had to find ways to integrate their experiences of American humanity with the anti-American hatred that had been central to their identity as Japanese soldiers. Dr. Yoshito Tanaka was one of the few Japanese military psychiatrists working with returning POWs. He noted the unique psychological challenges they faced. These men suffered from what we might now call survivor guilt, but it was complicated by cultural shame. They felt guilty not just for surviving, but for surviving well. The fact that they had gained weight, that they had been treated humanely, somehow made their survival seem even more shameful in society's eyes. Faced with social stigma and cultural shame, many returning POWs chose silence as their strategy. They rarely spoke about their experiences in American camps, particularly the generous treatment they had received. In a society struggling with starvation, admitting they had been well fed by the enemy seemed almost criminal. This silence had profound consequences for Japanese society. Japan was deprived of first-hand accounts of American military culture and values at precisely the moment when understanding their former enemy would have been most valuable. Stories of humane treatment, of adherence to international law even facing an enemy that had shown no such restraint, remained locked away in memories of men who felt they couldn't speak. Some POWs went to extraordinary lengths to hide their experiences completely. They claimed to have been sick or injured to explain their survival. Others invented stories of harsh treatment that more closely matched what society expected to hear. The reality that they had been treated with dignity and care seemed too dangerous to share publicly. Hiroshi Yamada had gained 38 pounds in American custody. He kept his experience secret for nearly 40 years. I told people I had been in a hospital camp, that I was too sick to work. I couldn't tell them the truth, that the Americans had fed me better than my own officers ever had, that they had treated me like a human being when I expected to be treated like an animal. It would have been seen as collaboration, as betrayal of everything we were supposed to believe. Despite social pressure toward silence, the experience of these POWs had planted seeds that would influence Japan's post-war development in subtle but important ways. Men who had experienced American democracy firsthand, who had seen the efficiency of American industrial organization and the humanity of American military culture, became part of a generation that helped rebuild Japan along more democratic lines. Many found themselves quietly supportive of American occupation reforms, even when they couldn't publicly admit their reasons. They had seen that Americans were capable of treating former enemies with respect and dignity. This made the prospect of American occupation less terrifying than it might otherwise have been. The physical evidence of their treatment, their restored health, their weight gain, their survival itself, became silent testimony to American adherence to international law and humanitarian principles. In a war that had seen systematic brutality on multiple fronts, the story of Japanese POWs in American hands stood as a remarkable example of how warfare could be conducted within moral boundaries. As Japan rebuilt and democratized in the decades following the war, the experiences of these POWs began influencing broader social and political attitudes, even if their stories remained largely untold. The children and grandchildren of these men grew up in a Japan increasingly aligned with American values of democracy, individual rights, and international cooperation. Some historians argue that humane treatment of Japanese POWs contributed to Japan's relatively smooth transition from enemy to ally during the Cold War period. The men who had experienced American generosity firsthand, even if they couldn't speak about it openly, formed part of a generation prepared to work with, rather than against their former enemies. The weight gain that had so marked their return home became, in retrospect, a symbol of fundamental differences between democratic and authoritarian approaches to warfare. American forces had demonstrated that it was possible to defeat an enemy while still maintaining moral standards, to win a war without abandoning humanity. Today, the story of Japanese POWs in American hands during World War II offers profound lessons about the nature of warfare, the importance of international law, and the power of human dignity to transcend even the deepest hatreds. These men who had expected torture and death instead found medical care, adequate nutrition, and treatment that followed established international standards. Their physical transformation, the 30, 40, 50 pounds they gained while in captivity, became a powerful symbol of what happens when military forces commit to maintaining humanitarian standards even in the midst of total war. In contrast to the systematic brutality that characterized Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners, American forces demonstrated that victory and humanity were not mutually exclusive concepts. The silence that surrounded their experiences for so many years speaks to the complex psychological and cultural challenges that societies face in coming to terms with war and defeat. But their stories, when they finally began to be told, offered proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, it is possible to choose compassion over cruelty, dignity over degradation. The Japanese soldiers who gained 50 pounds in American prison camps carried more than extra weight when they returned home. They carried evidence of a different way of thinking about war, about enemies, and about the fundamental worth of human beings. Their well-fed faces and healthy bodies stood as silent witnesses to the possibility that even total war need not require abandonment of basic human decency. In a conflict that saw unimaginable brutality on all sides, their story remains a reminder that choices always exist, even in the darkest circumstances. The American decision to feed their enemies well, to treat them with dignity, and to follow international law even when facing an opponent that showed no such restraint, demonstrated that maintaining moral standards is not just possible in wartime. It may be when those standards matter most of all. The weight they gained was more than nutrition recovered. It was testament to the enduring power of human dignity, a reminder that how we treat our enemies ultimately defines who we are as human beings. The metal trays that once held impossibly generous portions became symbols of something larger than food. They represented the choice to remain human even when humanity itself seemed under attack.